Assimilation is all about relationships. And that's what we're talking about today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host AJ Matthew. And today we're talking about assimilation, which, in some church circles, I think, is almost like a bad word. People don't like the word assimilation. Have you heard this some?
Yeah, it's not in the common vernacular for most people. So probably if they had to start defining it, maybe they would think about negative things, negative sides of it.
I think people think of like Star Trek and the Borg, you will be assimilated.
Maybe some people would think that, Scott. Yes. Others, not so much.
I'm just saying, people kind of think of assimilation, and I don't know. It's not the most like humanizing term, maybe.
We went this. You can edit this out if you want to. I'm sure that I won't. We went to a local historic town to do some little Christmas browsing and everything, a little fun, little family outing. And we walked into a shop that we didn't really know what it was, just like, oh, let's go see what they have in here. And it turned out to be probably, some folks that would have a strong Star Trek interest, if you're catching my drift. Lots of figurines and games. And we were like, oh, this isn't anything we would be interested in. They may, had we stuck around, tried to assimilate us. There you go.
They're trying to assimilate you into the Borg. That's a thing. And like the three people who are into science fiction know exactly what I'm talking about. At any rate, regardless, I think it is like a word that's not the most humanizing term, using the word assimilation. And that's exactly what we want to do today on the podcast. Is
to some extent. I mean, we want to
humanize the process.
Yes, that's right. We want to make assimilation a little bit more human, and we mean by that is blending a family together, right? Maybe that's a kind of a nice way of saying it. We want to bring people into the family,
or we might say it's like building a relationship.
Yes,
and so that's the metaphor that we want to use, and it is a metaphor in a sense, especially how we're going to use it. But at face value, that's what it is too. If you want to have guests become regular attenders, become members, and really integrate into the life of your church, you have to build a relationship with people. So we're going to be using a marriage metaphor today. And so obviously you aren't marrying people who come to your church, obviously, but you are building a relationship with them. And so I think it's a helpful way for thinking about and contextualizing the process. Yeah. So, all right. All that said, AJ, if we're going to be having some newcomers and guests in the Christmas season, we want to assimilate folks and see them become a part of our church body and church life. How do we need to do this? What's this process? How does it need to start?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it starts with building a strategy on the front end. So many churches, they will think that, hey, we're going to have guests. It's Christmas time. And then the next thing that might come out of somebody's mouth is, I hope some of them will want to stay. I hope. And they'll go into the Christmas season with hope, as we should. But it's going to take strategy to move hope of guests sticking around into guests actually sticking around. Otherwise, it's going to be hit or miss. And we only get like a couple of 2, maybe 3 key areas every year in which we can expect guests and then be able to intentionally capitalize on that. So
I hope not. I hope you have 52 opportunities where you're expecting guests. But
I know a lot of churches, Christmas, Easter, back to school, which is
those are the guarantees.
Big church deal. So anyway, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, what would be the starting point then if we go, all right, we really do want to build a strategy around this. We want to be intentional. We want to not just leave it entirely to chance.
That's right.
How do we start? What's the first thing we should do?
we start with the end in mind. Let's first establish, what is the end goal? What do we really want people to do? And you can't just say, well, we want them to, be a part of the church. We need to really kind of figure out on the front end, when we start building out an assimilation process, what is sort of that final step that we want to consider them being in the process? And that could be a variety of things, right, Scott? Membership, small group, something else.
Yeah, I mean, it almost seems like a throwaway point, but it's so missing in the majority of churches that we work with. They don't think through, well, when do you count someone as assimilated?
Yeah.
How do you know? Assimilated doesn't mean fully discipled. There's a discipleship pathway process that you're going to have, and there's going to be a maturity process and all of that. But just like if you're to look at sort of a relationship, the wedding is not the end, it's the beginning of a new phase of the relationship, right?
Yeah. All right.
Similarly, you have to define, like, what is that moment where we have moved from, hey, we're in process, we're forming this relationship, to the next phase, which is more of a maturation process. So what is that wedding moment for you? And it is going to be different from church to church. Maybe it's becoming a member, maybe it's joining a group or a class, maybe it's joining a volunteer team. Depends on kind of what your discipleship pathway process is. And if you're like, I don't know what that is, and we don't have that, well, that's a larger conversation, larger than we're going to have today. But you need to define, what is that moment in time, that actionable, measurable moment that you can go, this happened. So they've crossed that line from one phase of the relationship to the next phase of the relationship.
Right. Yep. So in our metaphor here, that's the marriage definition. Like, at this point, we can kind of consider ourselves married, and we're going to circle back around to that at the end of this to unpack that a little bit more. But determining and defining the end is defining, what does marriage look like for people that are coming into our church? And
yeah. Well, and before we keep going with that, I kind of want to push the metaphor a little bit.
Okay.
We live in, of course, this is not something I can relate to at all, seeing as I've been married for how many years now? Almost 15 years, almost 15, coming up on 15.
Better know. You got to know this.
I'm between 14 and 15. And so this is not something I can relate to in any way, shape, or form. But, it's a hookup culture today. Like, I can't even imagine what it's like for people today, downloading apps and trying to meet people and whatever. And half the people, it seems like, aren't even looking for any sort of real relationship. They're just looking for some sort of a person to hang out with or whatever. And the thing is, a lot of churches treat newcomers that way too, very casually, like, well, maybe they'll come back, maybe they won't. You really ought to feel like every person who is showing up at your church is a person you want to get into a serious relationship with. Well, again, I know that this is the limit of the metaphor. You can only be married to one person, but you should be looking for a long-term committed relationship with these people in discipleship, and not just treat them so casually. And I think that is a problem in our churches, that mirrors a problem in our culture as it comes to relationships. People treat relationships casually. I'm not looking for anything serious or whatever. And that's backed up in the whole process. Everything that follows that then is completely unserious, lack of intentionality. And I think that we see that in our churches, as well as in relationships. Yeah,
that's true. It has become very casual, and a lot of people, push back on even the idea of membership. And this has been a problem for churches, especially churches, whose tradition is very membership centric. This, just the way our culture has moved, and especially younger people, they're like, what exactly am I signing on for with this? Right. Or what's the purpose? Why is that even necessary? So if membership is your marriage end, then even that, I'm not saying, don't have membership anymore, but you just need to make sure that you're talking about it in a way that's relevant to the culture, and understandable, and benefits are clearly explained and understood, all these things. But
right.
it could be a lot of churches don't care necessarily that much anymore about a formal membership. And they just want to see people engaged in relationships. Could be small groups or classes or volunteering and being a part of the church that way. So there's a lot
That's
of
right.
angles to this. But again, our first point here on defining the end, the marriage, is whatever that is for your church, as long as you know what you're working towards, because you can't build an effective strategy towards a goal without defining the goal.
That's right. If marriage is what you're after, determine what is the wedding. What moment is the wedding? Is it when they've finished a membership class, joined a small group, joined a volunteer team? Define what that wedding moment is so that you can know when the marriage has begun. So that's point number one.
There we go. Okay. Now we've figured that out. Now we've got a process. What is our strategy going to be is the question now to get to that end. So first of all, we've got to consider our communication strategy. How clearly, how consistently will we communicate what we're asking people to do as this first step? And this is true of almost any strategy in the church or outside the church for that matter. Communication has got to be key. And there's definitely, some best practices for this, Scott.
Yeah, I would. I've pointed to this book a number of times in the podcast, and I would encourage you again to check it out. You can buy it on Amazon, I believe. But this book, Boomerang, by Tyler Smith and Allison Hoffmeyer from Texton Church. One little tip that they have in here on communication and guest follow-up that I think is really good is they say a good communication follow-up strategy is content plus frequency plus duration. And what that means is you have to be communicating on the content side. What is it that you want people to do next? Which we're going to talk about here in a minute in our next step. But you have to have a point. You can't just be like, hey, thanks for coming. Hope you had a good time. I mean, it needs to be productive and important content. And you also need to consider the means. Like, so what's the best mode? I know that if I want to get a quick answer from someone on an issue, I probably shouldn't send an 18-page long email, right? I should maybe send a text message, or maybe not even a phone call would be good. You know that people are more likely to respond to a text. So think through those different mediums, which would be best. You also want to think about frequency. So a lot of churches will send a letter in the mail one time and then go, well, we tried. Imagine if you were starting a relationship with someone, AJ, and after you meet at the coffee shop, you send them a letter in the mail. It was nice to meet you at the coffee shop. Sure would be nice to see you again sometime. And then you never did anything else. That's not nothing. They might go, oh, well, that was nice. So yeah, I enjoyed meeting them too. I wonder if they're going to call me. I wonder if they're going to send me a text or whatever.
Yeah.
Or imagine sending just one text message and then never anything else. So needs to be more frequent, but also the duration. So you can't just give up. You can't send 10 text messages in 1 week. You shouldn't do that. But you could maybe send 10 messages over the course of a month or a month and a half and kind of spread out that process. So content plus frequency plus duration, that's going to help build a good communication follow-up strategy.
Yeah, there you go. Maybe
it's going to vary from church to church.
Yeah. And if you're doing anything electronic like that, emails and text messages, a good practice is a way for people to be able to opt out of that at some point.
Sure.
Too. So
right.
you are, if you've exceeded what they're comfortable with, they can click unsubscribe and not get
just
that.
Like a relationship, right? If they're like, I'm not interested.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so let's move on now. We're continuing, or actually at this point, we're really sort of getting started. So we're communicating well with a guest, and we're inviting them out on the first date. What is our first date going to be? And I guess what a lot of churches do is similar to what people might actually do in the real world on a date. It could be a lunch, a guest lunch. It could be a coffee. Some of these very non-committal, non-scary, short in duration engagements that we can just get to know each other a little bit.
Yeah, you do have to think about this. So let's kind of take a step back and think, all right, well, let's say we've defined what our wedding is, AJ. It's joining a group, it's going through a growth track and becoming a member, it's joining the volunteer team, whatever that is for your church. We've defined what the wedding is that begins the marriage. And very often what we do with a guest when they first show up is we've now, maybe that's akin to meeting them in a coffee shop. We meet them in the coffee shop for the very first time and we go, let's get married. And that's very intimidating and scary and irrational to some degree. Similarly, if the second someone visits your church, the first thing you say is, hey, join the group, become a member, whatever. It's maybe more than they're ready to take on right away. So you really ought to have a first date. So a lunch or a coffee, some sort of an event that doesn't require any further commitment. It can just help them get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah. And this most likely is a group or small group event.
Sure.
Could be one-on-one, depending on, maybe, I don't know, what your church is like, the general culture of your church or something like that. But people would probably be more likely to come to a non-intimidating group function than hey, let's just go one-on-one to coffee. That might be a good next step.
Yeah, I agree. So keep it simple. Doesn't have to be complicated or difficult, but the churches that I've been working with over the last several years that have done this have found this to be really rewarding because it takes people from a bigger environment. Even if you're not a huge church, you can be a church of just, of 100 people. But if you take the 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 guests that you've had over the last couple of months or month or week, whatever your time scale is, and you're able to pull them into a smaller room and actually connect with them in a different kind of environment, it really does start to transition that relationship from a large room or an electronic one, like maybe you've had some text message exchanges or email exchanges with them, to something more personal and more real and more face-to-face.
Yeah. Yep. And consider all things as well. Is this a group of people that are families? They have small kids. Do we need to have something for kids to do? More childcare available? So got to be considering all these things, what the makeup of the populace might be. All right. That was kind of a first datey kind of thing. And that could actually continue on. There could be a couple of, like dating process things that you might put out there. Next step, something maybe a little bit more of a commitment, could be, more of sort of maybe the beginning of an engagement phase, in which this could be a new member class, although even that is kind of like, okay, maybe we'll get married at the end of this. It could be maybe something to find out about volunteering, a process for getting involved in that, or exploring maybe even a newcomers small group, a temporary thing, like a little group scenario that's going to run for like 3 months and it's only new people. Lots of options here, but this is going to be sort of the engagement phase. Like, okay, dating is going pretty well. I can see where this could be a long-term relationship. Let's kind of take the relationship to the next level, Scott.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you might. Oh man, I just was thinking. This reminds me of. It takes a whole nother meaning to Rick Warren's first base, second base, third base.
Let's not go there.
Keep it on first base, people, when you're dating.
Until marriage, Scott.
Until marriage, that's right. Yeah. Ooh, I don't know. I don't think I'm going to edit this one out, but give us some grace. I'm just cracking a joke. People, lighten up. But in all seriousness, there is something nice about. I personally prefer. I like the growth track model. It's like 4 weeks, and it does give people off ramps. The goal is for it to be an on ramp, but it does give people off ramps. The first week of a growth track is usually talking about, the beliefs of the church's, not only where it's going in terms of vision, but also what do we stand for? What are our open-handed and our closed-handed issues? Just like in an engagement, you got to find what that is. Are we equally yoked on certain issues? And there's got to be an off-ramp. If you go, well, you know what, we have a completely different worldview on this or that, you need an off-ramp. And so I like Growth Track for that reason, because it's not just meeting just to meet. Each meeting has a particular goal in mind to bring you along, and then it concludes with usually joining a team. But it could be something else. But it usually ends in a wedding of some kind. It ends in a wedding. So what is that for your church? What is that intentional process that a person can jump into with an intention of getting to the wedding, but gives them some off ramps if they're not ready or if it's not the right fit for their family?
Yeah, that's right. So this takes us up to, again, where we started. We've developed a relationship along the way, and we're ending with a wedding. We've decided, you know what, we are a great fit for each other, and let's make this long term. Let's pull the trigger on this deal. So we need to then be thinking about, and again, as Scott said at the front end, this is the beginning of this new phase of relationship now, which will be involved with your discipleship pathway and their lifelong process of sanctification and participation in your church. But now is the time that we've got to be thinking also about, how are we measuring this? How are we measuring success of these marriage relationships now? Because as I suppose can happen in real marriages, a wedding might take place, but nothing really comes of the relationship after that. And it might even deteriorate because of a lot of factors, right? But it could be communication problems. It could be that we don't truly engage with one another as we thought we would. So what does success of this marriage process really look like? Maybe they said, okay, I'm going to join the church, but they never have joined a small group, or they're not a part of any Sunday school class. They're not serving anywhere. So thoughts and ideas maybe were expressed, commitments maybe were expressed, but the proof hasn't really been borne out of it. So this is where we've got to be looking, because if we think, hey, look at the numbers, 80% of that group got through all of Growth Track and they became members in the church. And if we see this number on a spreadsheet and we just turn away our attention now to just whatever is happening everywhere else and never look back at where those people really are, we truly have not gotten anywhere. We've gone through an exercise over weeks or months, and it hasn't really landed the church in anywhere better. So we have to shift our attention now to, okay, that's the end of our assimilation process. And now let's see, how well are we really building the relationship forward now in this marriage union?
Yeah, it's so good. I mean, there's such value in measuring things and in knowing, all right, where are people falling off in that sort of dating and, dating and engagement process leading up to the wedding? Where do people seem to be losing the most people? Is it that we're not, they're showing up as newcomers and then they're not attending that sort of low commitment step? Are they not moving from that to whatever that engagement type process is? Are people bailing as they get through that engagement process, and maybe they're seeing red flags about the church and don't want to get to the wedding? If you ought to be tracking these things so that you can identify problems. You're never going to hit 100%. You're never going to get 100% of the people who visit your church show up to a newcomer event, go through, whatever your process is, and get to the wedding. That's okay. But you really ought to be able to identify if there's a big gap, people are not taking this step. That should be a red flag for you and something that you can chase down a little bit. And on to your point, AJ, you got to keep measuring past that. Yeah. What is our discipleship pathway? How do we want people to grow and mature in their faith, and what steps are they taking? So the wedding is just a moment in the process. and you got to measure behind and you got to measure ahead. And that makes so many pastors queasy, AJ. They just don't love the idea of measuring things. And to that I say, get over it. This is another
I was going to say, get over it.
Yeah, this is another one of those eat your veggies leadership things where it's like, yeah, you may not enjoy it, or you may give you some nausea, but the joke is still true. God's not against numbers. There's a book of the Bible called Numbers, so you can count. We're not counting for the point of counting. We're counting for the point of shepherding. If you aren't counting the sheep, you won't know the one that has gone missing. So it looks like roughly 100. I mean, you'd have to count the sheep to know that 99 are there and one is gone.
Yeah.
You can't just spitball it. You have to count.
That's right. Okay. Well, I hope this is something that you'll take to heart and consider the relationships that you're seeking to build in your church. You've been listening or maybe watching episode 118 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. And you can, if you are listening, we would love for you to go over to our channel on YouTube and subscribe over there. You can get the video version of this. We've included some discussion questions for your church staff team down in the comment and the discussion box below.
Thank you again for listening to today's episode of the Church Revitalization Podcast. This has been episode 118. You can read today's show notes at malfersgroup.com/118. And AJ asked you to go online and subscribe on YouTube. If you're just, already on your phone and subscribing to things and checking boxes and so on, and just want to help us out, drop us a review on iTunes. If you are an iTunes Apple Podcast subscriber, the way that I am, would you just give us a rating? Those things help us too. So it's like putting something in the tip jar that costs you nothing to help us out by subscribing and giving us a good rating. And it helps us get this information out to more folks. So thank you for listening to today's episode of the Church Revitalization Podcast. We'll be back with you next week.